An ocean liner with over 2,200 people on board was sailing across the North Atlantic at a constant speed, passing through an area where ice was a common feature. Visible conditions showed no immediate danger. The sea was calm, it was pitch black, and the voyage was proceeding as planned. As the crossing continued, isolated incidents began to occur at different points on the ship, some visible only to a few and others impossible to observe in their entirety. What happened didn't leave a single image or a complete sequence, and several scenes were fragmented from the very beginning. What really happened during that voyage? Why didn't the Titanic slow down that night? On the afternoon of April 14, 1912, the ocean liner was sailing across the North Atlantic on a route that had been traveled many times by other ships, although the conditions that day were unusual. Throughout the day, ice warnings began arriving from various vessels sailing in the same area. These messages warned of the presence of icebergs and large ice fields floating in the planned route, some of them directly in the path the ship was following westward. The warnings did not all arrive at the same time or with the same level of detail. Some mentioned large isolated blocks, others spoke of extensive concentrations of ice. The messages were received during the morning, continued into the afternoon, and kept coming well into the night. Each one was noted and relayed by the radio operators, and several of them reached the bridge, where the officers recorded the available information. Despite this constant stream of warnings, the ship's speed remained steady. From the start of the day, the ship's speed hovered around 22 knots, a typical figure for a vessel of that size in open water. There is no record of a clear order to reduce speed during the day. Why wasn't the speed adjusted? As night fell, the sky was clear, and darkness gradually descended. Ice warnings remained a constant threat. The ship continued forward, propelled by its engines at a similar pace to that maintained throughout the day. In the hours leading up to the collision, new messages arrived reinforcing the idea that ice was abundant in the area. Some described large ice fields, others spoke of multiple icebergs visible in the distance. This information was received while the ship continued its advance. On the bridge, the officers continued their night watch, monitoring navigation and communications. The presence of ice was considered a known risk in those latitudes, especially at that time of year. The speed was maintained under the expectation that the vessel could maneuver if a visible obstacle appeared with sufficient advance notice. This lack of adjustment, known to those in command, was incorporated into the sequence of decisions that preceded the impact. How could an iceberg go unnoticed until the very last moment? The night progressed without any visible disturbances as the ship crossed the North Atlantic enveloped in an unusual calm. The sea was so smooth it resembled a polished surface, devoid of foam, with no waves crashing against the hull. This stillness, which in other circumstances would have been an advantage, became a silent factor that completely changed how the ice could be perceived from the deck. Under these conditions, the usual contrasts vanished, and the horizon became a dark, almost uniform line. The darkness was profound. There was no moon illuminating the sea, and the clear sky offered no clear reference points. The absence of waves eliminated one of the few visual clues that usually betrayed the presence of ice at a distance. The white band of water breaking against a solid mass. That night, this natural warning was absent. If ice was ahead, it didn't generate any visible signs until it was too close. High atop the ship, the lookouts kept watch, scanning the horizon with their eyes fixed on the blackness. They strained to discern any distinct shape, any shadow that didn't belong to the sky or the sea. The task demanded constant concentration, but human nature imposed limits that couldn't be overcome with mere attention. In complete darkness, the human eye takes time to adapt, and even then loses precision when there are no clear landmarks. The cold was intense and the air clear, which could give the impression of excellent visibility. However, that clarity was deceptive. On nights like this, large nearby objects could blend into the dark background until the very last moment. The ice didn't reflect its own light, and its silhouette merged with the surroundings. Without waves, without reflections, without contrast, the iceberg didn't appear as a distinct block, but as a barely perceptible dark mass. As the minutes ticked by, the ship continued onward and time was working against the lookouts. Night vision doesn't work the same way as during the day. The eye loses sharpness, edges become blurred, and depth is harder to judge. What appears to be a distant shadow might be nothing at all, and what's indistinguishable could already be dangerously close. Under these conditions, detection depends on seconds. When the iceberg finally appeared in the field of vision, it didn't emerge as a clear, defined image. It was a shape that rose from the darkness, a mass that broke the horizon line without giving time to process what it was. In that instant, the brain had to quickly interpret what the eyes could barely make out. The warning was given immediately, but the window of opportunity was already minimal. Added to this was a phenomenon known to sailors of the time, although difficult to identify at the time. Under certain temperature and cold air conditions, light bends subtly and alters the perception of distant objects. The horizon can appear high and distant shapes are distorted. It's not obvious, but it contributes to a large object becoming less visible until it's very close. The lookouts acted the instant the iceberg was identified as such. The warning was transmitted without delay, but the window of opportunity was so narrow that the available time was measured in seconds. There was no chance of early detection that would have allowed for a widespread response. Human perception, faced with the darkness, the calm of the sea, and the lack of landmarks, had reached its limit. Why wasn't a correct maneuver enough? The warning came from above when the iceberg was already ahead. In that instant, time compressed until it became almost non-existent. What followed were seconds in which every order, every gesture, and every mechanical response cascaded together without room for corrections. There was no space for deliberation. The maneuver began immediately. On the bridge, the reaction was automatic. The voice urgently relayed the order to the helm, seeking to steer the ship away from the threat that had just emerged from the darkness. The helmsman responded instantly, turning the wheel forcefully, following the procedure learned and repeated for years. The objective was clear: to change course enough to avoid direct contact. At the same time, action was taken on the engines. The instruction was transmitted to the appropriate control room to modify the operation of the engines. The levers moved and the gauges responded. But the ship was neither light nor agile. Every change needed time to translate into a real effect on the hull's movement, and that time was scarce. The combination of helm commands and engine adjustments was executed swiftly, but the ship's behavior in those critical seconds could not be immediately and clearly assessed. Accumulated inertia, available space, and the hull's actual response overlapped within an extremely narrow margin. The ship continued moving forward, while the helm began to force a change of direction, and the effect of the turn was not instantaneously apparent. Everything happened in a closed sequence, with no possibility of correcting or verifying whether the maneuver was sufficient. In that brief interval, the margin was minimal. The maneuver aimed to avoid a head-on collision and apparently succeeded in altering the trajectory, but it is unclear to what extent that change could have been decisive. The bow began to deviate, although the hull continued approaching the ice on a trajectory that was not yet fully defined. Contact occurred while the ship was still responding to commands, at a moment when the maneuver was still unfolding. The result was a side collision, different from what would have happened without any reaction. It was not a direct head-on impact, but neither was it a complete evasion. The iceberg was left behind, and the damage was already done. What could not be determined with certainty is whether there was any real alternative in those final seconds, or if, from the moment the iceberg was sighted, the outcome was already sealed. The maneuver was correct according to known procedures, but the timing, the location, and the ship's response still leave open the question of why it wasn't enough. Why did no one see the rupture? The sinking progressed gradually in the initial moments, with the ship still illuminated and maintaining a position that suggested no imminent collapse. The bow sank slowly while the stern remained raised, creating an increasingly steep tilt. From the deck, many of those still on board perceived the movement as a steady fall, not a sudden break. Nothing clearly indicated that the structure was about to give way. As the minutes passed, the tilt increased. The angle became evident in the passageways, on the stairways, and on the outer decks. Loose objects began to slide, and water continued to advance into areas that had previously remained dry. The ship remained intact in view, long and continuous, its lights still on, and its silhouette recognizable against the night. In that final stretch, the attention of those near the hull was focused on the rising stern and the unstoppable descent of the bow. The sound of the water rushing in, the creaking of the structure, and the noise of shifting elements dominated the atmosphere. perception was fragmented by fear, darkness, and confusion. There was no complete view of the whole, only partial scenes from different angles. Some witnesses recalled feeling an unusual vibration under their feet, a brief but intense sensation, distinct from the constant movement of the sinking. Others spoke of a sharp noise, as if something had given way inside the ship. However, these impressions were neither uniform nor consistent. Many noticed nothing out of the ordinary at that moment. The extreme position of the hull hindered any clear observation. With its stern raised, the structure was subjected to stresses that were not visible from the outside. Those watching from the water or from a distance saw a dark, tilted and moving silhouette, but could not distinguish precise details. The darkness and chaos made continuous and orderly observation impossible. Some claimed to have seen the ship list even more suddenly, as if the fall had accelerated for a few seconds. Others maintained that the descent was continuous, without any abrupt changes. Accounts contradicted each other, even among people who were relatively close to one another. The lack of a stable point of reference meant that each perception was different. There was no clearly identifiable moment when everyone could point to a visible break. No obvious separation of the structure from the surface was described. For many, the ship simply disappeared underwater in a final, confusing sequence, shrouded in sounds, screams, and darkness. The idea that the hull had broken apart did not stick in the collective memory of that night. After the sinking, the first reconstructions assumed that the ship had gone down whole. The available accounts did not offer a clear description of a visible break, and most testimonies did not mention a complete separation into two parts. For decades, this version remained the accepted explanation of what happened in the final moments. However, some isolated accounts continued to point to strange sensations at the final moment. People who had been at the stern mentioned an extreme list, followed by a sudden jolt. Others recalled a distinct sound, louder than the rest, just before the ship disappeared from sight. None of these testimonies agreed on enough detail to reconstruct a clear scene. The lack of a direct view was also due to the observers' positions. Those in the water saw the ship from below and at a distance, its silhouette outlined against the night. Those on board were in constant motion, without a complete perspective of the whole. No one had a clear, uninterrupted view of the entire structure at the critical moment. For a long time, this lack of visual confirmation left the question open. The breakup became a discussed possibility, but not an accepted fact. The contradictory descriptions and the lack of visible evidence prevented a definitive conclusion. The sinking continued to be interpreted as a gradual descent of a single vessel. 5. Why didn't the visible ship respond? As the ocean liner approached its end, the North Atlantic night remained clear and silent. The sea was still calm, and the moonless sky offered profound darkness in every direction. In that setting, any light that appeared on the horizon could be seen from a great distance. There were no waves to obscure flashes or thick fog to blur them. Visibility, at least for lights, was ample. When the gravity of the situation became apparent, visible signals began to appear from the ship in distress. Luminous flares soared into the night sky, one after another, piercing the darkness with brief, brilliant flashes. Each launch drew an arc of light that slowly faded before disappearing. From the deck, these signals were clear, unmistakable, designed to attract the attention of any vessel within a considerable radius. The flares were not launched in isolation or accidentally. They were sent at intervals, following a pattern recognizable to experienced mariners. Each burst momentarily illuminated the surroundings, reflecting off the smooth water like a dark mirror. They were visible signals, intended to be seen from afar, even by ships not in direct contact. At some distance, another vessel was either stationary or moving slowly in the same region of the ocean. It was not hundreds of kilometers away, but relatively close, within a range that, under normal circumstances, would have allowed for easy observation of the lights ascending into the sky. The exact distance could never be established with absolute precision, but later estimates placed it short enough to allow for a response. From the ship in distress, some people observed lights on the horizon that appeared to belong to another vessel. They were not stars or random reflections. They were low, steady points of light, with the typical appearance of a vessel stationary or moving at low speed. This sight reinforced the hope that the signals were being seen and understood. Throughout the night, the rockets continued to rise. Each one represented a direct call, a silent plea to any ship that might see them. Yet, no response came from the other vessel. No approaching lights were observed, nor were there any obvious maneuvers to indicate a reaction. The distant silhouette remained in place, unchanged. Despite the signals, there was no movement toward the sinking area, nor any clear indication that the gravity of the situation had been grasped. The lack of response grew more unsettling as the minutes ticked by. The flares continued to ascend, but the horizon showed no change. The other ship was still there, visible, but motionless. The distance, while not exact, seemed short enough to allow for a reaction within a reasonable time frame. Some interpretations arose even during the night. From the sinking ship, it was assumed that the other vessel was seeing the signals and would, at some point, initiate a close approach. That anticipation lingered for a while, fueled by the constant presence of those distant lights. The wait grew increasingly tense. The rockets would briefly illuminate the scene, and then everything would return to darkness. Each flash was followed by seconds of visual silence, during which the horizon seemed unchanged. The repetition of this pattern reinforced the feeling that something wasn't working as it should. At that point, the doubt no longer lay in the visibility of the signals, but in something else. Why was there no reaction? From the deck, the lights were still there. The distance didn't seem insurmountable, and time continued to pass without an answer. Why weren't the lifeboats enough? As the severity of the damage became apparent, a silent reality took hold on deck. The available resources seemed incapable of handling the number of people on board. The lifeboats were there, visible, lined up on both sides, but their number soon began to contrast sharply with the scale of the impending evacuation. This disproportion wasn't immediately apparent. It became clear as the process unfolded and time dwindled. The ship was carrying more than 2,000 people, passengers and crew. Faced with that number, the available lifeboats offered limited capacity. The system wasn't designed to evacuate everyone at once, but rather to transfer groups to other ships that, under normal circumstances, would come to their aid. This idea was part of the original plan, but that night, help didn't materialize immediately, exposing the limitations of the intended scheme. As the order to prepare the lifeboats was given, a process began that had never been rehearsed in a real-life situation of this magnitude. The assigned crew members acted according to general instructions, but without prior experience covering a scenario like the one unfolding. Each boat had to be prepared, loaded and lowered while the ship continued to list. Boarding was not uniform. Some disembarked quickly, while others did so with empty spaces. In the first moments, the magnitude of the danger was not understood by everyone, and there was reluctance to board small boats in the middle of the night. This initial hesitation may have contributed to the partial occupancy of several boats, further reducing the effective capacity in those initial moments. The process progressed in parallel with the sinking. While one boat was being prepared, the ship's angle changed, making maneuvers more difficult. The decks were no longer level, and the descent became increasingly complex. Coordination demanded speed, but also care, since any mistake could cause further accidents. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of scarcity became more pronounced. People began to realize that their options were limited. The presence of the lifeboats, far from offering security, underscored the fragility of the system in the face of an emergency of this magnitude. The filling of the lifeboats did not follow a consistent pattern. In some cases, the priority was to get them into the water quickly before the ship's angle rendered them unusable. In others, attempts were made to fill them to capacity, but time, confusion, and changing conditions interfered. The result was an uneven distribution of rescued people. As the lifeboats moved further away, the deck became increasingly devoid of visible alternatives. The gap between the number of people and the remaining resources seemed to widen with each passing minute. In the final moments, when no lifeboats were available or conditions prevented their safe use, the evacuation stalled. It remained unclear whether this interruption was solely due to a lack of resources, or if other factors, such as time, the ship's list, or decisions made under pressure, also played a role. What was exposed was a system that, faced with a total emergency, failed to provide a sufficient response for everyone. The question that remains is whether the shortage of boats alone explains the outcome, or if it was just one of several factors that converged in those final minutes. Did the shooting really happen that night? The evacuation proceeded under mounting tension as the ship continued to list. The night was pitch black, the sea remained calm, and the deck was filled with chaotic movement. People who didn't know each other were crammed into increasingly confined spaces, with instructions shouted out and a sense of urgency growing by the minute. In that context, every sound took on a different intensity, amplified by fear and confusion. Among the officers in charge of maintaining order was an element not visible to everyone, but part of the standard equipment: firearms. They weren't exceptional or improvised for that night. They were there as part of the standard equipment, intended for specific situations requiring authority and control. Their presence didn't necessarily imply their use, but it did introduce a possibility that, amidst the chaos, became unsettling. As the lifeboats were prepared and lowered, the crowd gathered at the boarding points. Voices overlapped, orders mingled, and the perception of the surroundings fragmented. Not everyone heard or saw the same thing. In that constant noise, some claimed to have heard brief, sharp explosions, unlike any other sound of the night. These accounts began to emerge after the sinking, when survivors shared what they believed they had heard or seen. Some spoke of shots fired into the air to impose silence or clear a crowded area. Others claimed to have seen an officer point a weapon amidst the chaos. The accounts agreed on the essential point, the presence of gunfire, but diverged on the details. At the same time, other survivors denied having heard or seen anything of the sort. For them, the night was dominated by shouts, orders, and structural noises, but not by explosions. In their memories, there were no gunshots or weapons being fired. This contradiction became the core of the mystery. Two sets of testimonies that could not be reconciled. The chaos on deck hampered any precise observation. The lighting was uneven, with some areas in near darkness and others momentarily illuminated. People moved, stumbled, stopped, and then moved forward again. In that scenario, identifying the exact source of a sound was almost impossible. A sharp noise could be mistaken for the clang of metal, a valve releasing pressure, or an object falling. Auditory perception was also altered by the situation. Extreme stress modifies how sounds are registered. What for some was a clear gunshot, for others might have been a mechanical noise or a knock against the structure. The lack of a common point of reference meant that each experience was different. Those who claimed to have heard gunshots placed those sounds at specific moments during the evacuation, when the pressure on the boarding points was greatest. They spoke of moments when order seemed to be collapsing and when immediate intervention was needed to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. In these accounts, the gunshots were not presented as an isolated incident, but rather as an extreme response to a chaotic environment. However, none of these versions fully agreed on the number of shots fired, their exact location, or the identity of the shooter. Some mentioned a single shot, others spoke of several. Some placed them on a specific deck, others in a different area. This lack of agreement weakened the possibility of a clear reconstruction. The silence of other witnesses added to the confusion. People who were near the alleged locations of the shootings claimed to have heard nothing out of the ordinary. For them, the night was noisy, but not because of gunfire. This discrepancy could not be easily resolved, since both groups were speaking from experiences lived in the same place and time. The confirmed presence of weapons did not resolve the issue. Their existence did not imply that they had been used, nor was there any subsequent physical evidence to confirm gunfire, such as shell casings or visible damage. The scene did not allow for the preservation of that type of evidence, and any trace would have been lost at sea. Why could what happened in the radio room never be definitively reconstructed? As the ship slowly sank, one of the most critical areas remained active amidst the disaster, the communications room. There, work didn't stop after the impact had occurred, nor when water began to flood the ship's interior. Signals continued to be sent out, one after another, in a desperate attempt to signal the situation and call for help before it was too late. Sending messages was neither an isolated nor a brief act. For an extended period, transmissions remained active, repeating the distress call and providing basic information about the ship's position. The effort was sustained even as conditions worsened and the environment became increasingly dangerous. The radio room became one of the last places where a clear operational function was still being attempted. Unlike other areas of the ship, this space was cramped and fraught with tension. The constant hum of the equipment, the vibration of the structure, and the knowledge that time was running out created an extreme atmosphere. The people there were working under pressure, aware that every message could make a difference, but also that the margin for error was shrinking. As the minutes ticked by, conflicts began to erupt within the room. These weren't long or formal discussions, but rather brief clashes, born of stress and urgency. Priorities didn't always align, and decisions had to be made immediately. In this context, coordination became fragile, and any disagreement took on disproportionate importance. Accounts of what happened there began to diverge almost from the start. One of the survivors offered different versions of events at different times. In an initial account, they described a scene of direct confrontation with scuffles and extreme actions. Later, the same person presented a different version, with less violence and a different unfolding of events. These variations were not minor. Key details changed, such as who was present at certain times, what actions were taken, and how the situation was resolved. Each new statement altered the previous picture, creating a sequence difficult to follow and even harder to confirm. These weren't minor nuances, but substantial differences. The difficulty in reconstructing what happened was compounded by the fact that the other people involved didn't survive. Without their accounts, any attempt to compare the narratives remained incomplete. The story of the radio room came to depend almost entirely on a single voice, and that voice didn't remain consistent over time. The context didn't help with accuracy. The person who gave the testimony did so after having gone through an extreme experience, marked by fear, exhaustion, and loss. Memory, subjected to such an impact, didn't function as an exact record. Recollections could be altered, mixed up, or rearranged over time, even unintentionally. Despite the contradictions, some elements remained constant. Distress signals were sent and remained active for much of the sinking. The radio room wasn't abandoned immediately, and work continued as long as possible. That persistence is one of the few firm points amidst a fragmented narrative. The mystery isn't whether signals were sent, because that's beyond doubt, nor is it whether there was tension, because the context made it inevitable. The void lies in the concrete details, in the specific actions that took place within that enclosed space as the ship neared its end. What happened in the radio room was caught between the urgency of the moment and the fragility of human memory. Without clear records, without multiple witnesses, and with accounts that changed over time, the exact sequence was lost forever. The sinking of the Titanic was the result of a combination of decisions, natural circumstances, and technical limitations that converged at a critical moment. Although many events have been reconstructed, others remained incomplete from the start, fragmented between partial testimonies and situations that could never be directly observed. More than a century later, the tragedy is still marked by these unanswered questions. Not because of a lack of investigation, but because not everything left a trace. The Titanic remains a reminder of how far human knowledge can reach, and where the unknown begins.